I want to start today by showing you guys a video. This is a video from a news station in Cleveland, Ohio. And before I show you the video, I want to tell you that no one was seriously injured. That's important for you to know. So let's watch this.
Intentionally speeding through a red light at about 120 miles an hour is likely not what singer Carrie Underwood meant by her hit single, Jesus Take the Wheel. But Beechwood police say a Parma woman admits she quite literally let go and let God take the wheel of her teal Ford Taurus in mid-June. Beechwood traffic cameras captured her first running the red light at Richmond Road and Chicker Boulevard, slamming into another car. After losing control, she then crashed into a vehicle in the driveway of this Beechwood home and only stopped after colliding with the house. Beechwood police say the Parma woman approached them immediately and stated she was driving 120 miles per hour and intentionally ran the red light to test her faith in God. She stated that she's been going through some trials and tribulations recently and was fired from her job. She also told officers that she let her fear go and went for it. The woman's 12.
Okay, that is quite a story. And again, no one was seriously injured, so maybe we feel okay at least chuckling at it a little bit. But at the same time, it's kind of alarming. Are there really people who take Carrie Underwood's song, Jesus Take the Wheel, that literally? And if so, does having faith in God mean we're supposed to just sit passively by while he determines the outcome of our lives? This series is called Misquoted. I'm taking some of the Christian cliches that we hear so often and use to try to summarize our faith or encourage one another. And my concern is that when we reduce Christianity to slogans and sound bites, that we may be communicating some things about God that are non-biblical. So the point of this series is for us to think biblically, think critically about some of these sayings that we tend to say or hear more often. And the saying we're going to talk about, the Christian cliche we're going to talk about today, is the one that woman used to justify her running that red light. It's the phrase, let go and let God. So as always, we're going to begin with the question, is there any biblical truth? I want to give this cliche the benefit of the doubt and ask if anything about this saying lines up with biblical teaching. It seems to me that when people use this phrase, what they're most often trying to communicate is that we should worry less and trust God more. And if that's the case, I would say that is definitely a biblical idea. Take 1 Peter 5, verse 7, for example. It says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Worry, stress, anxiety, those are very real things that happen to us, and the Bible's aware of that. The Bible talks about these things as burdens that we carry. Jesus says that they're like the weeds that choke out the seed of faith. So the Bible is very aware that we have anxiety, worry, that idea of not being able to sleep at night, that pit in your stomach. The Bible's familiar with it. And Peter's prescription here is to remember that God cares for you. There is a sense in which we can transfer the burden of our anxieties to God because he trusting that he will provide, that he will care for us. In that sense, then, by an act of faith, we can transfer the burden of our worry to God, knowing that he will give us what we need. Jesus says something very similar in the Sermon on the Mount. Right after talking about storing up your treasures in heaven, he says this. He says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, the body more important than clothes? Jesus says the material is not all that matters. The stuff in life that's really important is more than just stuff, right? Life is more important than food. Your body is more important than what you wear. The really important things, the relationships with others, selfless sacrifice, making a meaningful connection with God, are things that can't be measured by material things. So don't worry about what you're going to eat. Don't worry about what you're going to drink, because those things are going to bring you the really important things in life. Instead, Jesus says we need to trust that our Father in heaven knows what we need. A couple of verses later, Jesus says this. He says, so do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Our part is to pursue God's will, to follow his leading. And when we do, we can trust that God will provide us with what we need. In that sense, then, let go and let God is a very biblical idea. The next verse, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All these things will be given to you. The best antidote to anxiety is to follow God and do his will, knowing that he's going to provide you with what he knows you need. So it's foolishness to carry the worry of our burdens around, to carry around what God has already promised to carry for us. Again, in that sense, let go and let God is a very biblical idea. But again, it does not come from the Bible. It's not a direct Bible quote. And taken to an extreme, it can lead to some very dangerous and even absurd ideas. So as we've seen already, to quite literally take your hands off the steering wheel, thinking that by letting go, God will provide for you is a rather disturbed idea. Likewise, I've seen examples of Christians who think trusting in God to act means there's no action to be taken on our part. Really, the most tragic example I can think of are those parents who allow their sick children to suffer rather than seeking easily available medical treatment. Every once in a while, these stories will show up in the news of some court trying to intervene and bring medical treatment to some very treatable disease, but parents refusing because they're trusting in God to provide. In some cases, we don't find out about these things until it's too late. It seems there are some Christians who believe that demonstrating that God is capable of performing a miracle is more important than just following basic medical science. To expect God to intervene in a miraculous way when there are already normal courses of treatment available is really, that's the dark side of let go and let God. Let me talk about Psalm 91 Psalm 91 for a little bit. Psalm 91 begins like this: whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. I've heard Psalm 91 referred to as an amulet psalm. An amulet like you would wear around your neck to sort of protect you against evil. Scholars say that most likely this psalm was written at a time of national crisis in Israel's history, probably an outbreak of a deadly disease, because in a little bit he's going to make references to pestilence and plague. And so the idea was that the Israelites would pray this prayer with this idea that if we rest in the shadow of the Almighty, we'll be protected from this deadly thing. So verse 3 says this: surely he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. The psalm makes some remarkable promises. The next, verse 5, you will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. This psalm appears to be the ultimate let go and let God psalm, this promise that when we trust in God, he will protect us. Here are some of the other promises that this psalm makes. No harm will overtake you. Verse 10, no disaster will come near your tent. Also in verse 10, you will not strike your foot against a stone. In verse 12, you will tread on the lion and the cobra. It would seem that if you trust in God, this psalm is promising that no harm will come your way. We need to be careful, though, that we don't mistake metaphorical promises of God's care for us for literal promises that no physical harm will ever come our way. Because, let's face it, experience tells us, and there are a lot of other examples in the Bible that show us that while God can protect us spiritually, Christians are not immune from the suffering, the sickness, the illness, and death that still take place while we live in a fallen world. I think it's instructive that the only time Psalm 91 is quoted in the New Testament is when Jesus is being tempted by Satan. In Matthew's telling of that story, the second temptation, Satan takes Jesus to the highest point of Jerusalem, the very top of the temple, where everybody in the city can see him. And then he challenges Jesus to jump. And to encourage him to do so, he quotes Psalm 91. He says, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. In other words, the devil's saying, look, Jesus, here's a shortcut to the throne. Forget about all that conflict with the religious leaders. Forget about going to the cross. Here's what you do. You jump off the temple. God will send his angels just like he promises. Everybody will see that you're truly the Messiah, and you can just shortcut that whole thing that God has planned for you. And in response, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 6. He says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. In other words, sure, Jesus could jump and probably the angels would come and catch him. He could do that. But Jesus isn't about to do some crazy thing to prove his faith in God. And more importantly, he's not going to require God to prove his care for Jesus. And so when I hear stories of people who refuse normal means of care, ladies taking their hands off the steering wheel, or our parents refusing medical treatment for their ill children, I wonder if they're putting God to the test. To me, that doesn't seem to be an act of faith so much as an act of presumption towards God. There's a story, a parable. It's not a biblical parable, but it's one I've told several times. It's one maybe you've heard that I think illustrates this very well. The story goes that a man is living in the path of a quickly rising flood. And as the floodwaters rise up in his yard, a big SUV comes along, and the people inside say, come on, get in, we'll get you to safety. And the man says, no, I've prayed to God. God's going to protect me. You go on. Sometime later, the waters have filled his first level of his house. He's hanging out a second store window. Somebody comes by in a boat and says, come on, get in, we'll get you to safety. He says, no, I prayed to God. God will protect me. You go on. Still later, the waters are up to the roof. He's clinging to the chimney. Somebody comes by in a helicopter, throws a ladder down, and he waves them away. He says, no, I prayed to God. God will protect me. You go on. Sometime later, after the man has drowned, he's standing at the gates to heaven. And he walks up to God and he says, God, I put my faith in you. I really trusted you to save me. What happened? And God says, well, I sent a truck. I sent a boat. I sent a helicopter. What more did you want me to do? And so when I hear about people taking risks of faith in some sort of way, idea of proving that God will care for them, I want to ask, why are you putting God to the test? You know, the guy who won't put his seatbelt on because, if I get in an accident, God will protect me. I say, why do you expect God to intervene in some miraculous way when he's already provided a proven means of protection? All right, third, let's ask, is there better news in the gospel? What does the Bible have to say about the intersection of trusting in God and our own personal responsibility? Well, again, I think it's instructive that when Jesus talks to us about not worrying, the way he illustrates it is by pointing to the birds of the air. If we go back to the Sermon on the Mount, we'll see that Jesus says this. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Here's Jesus' example of the Father's provision, these birds. God provides the worms, God provides the seeds, and yet you never see a lazy bird, do you? There's a reason we say the early bird gets the worm, because way before you and I are out of bed, the birds are already out there working. They're already out there collecting their daily meal. See, there's a difference between faith and presumption. Faith says that as I follow God's lead and I seek his will, I trust that God will provide for me. Presumption, on the other hand, says I'm going to make all kinds of terrible choices and then I'm going to expect God to make my losses good. Having faith in God is not an excuse for the Christian to be passive. Let's go back to 1 Peter 5, verse 7, the verse I started with, but this time let's look at the full context of this verse. It says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. We've already talked about that. But notice what comes next. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith. I want you to pay attention to the action verbs in verse 8 there. It says, be alert, be sober-minded, resist the devil, stand firm. Yes, Peter says, God cares for you. You can push all your anxiety onto God because he's got this. And as a result, that's not an excuse for you to check out and be passive. Instead, it's because God has this that you should stand firm. Resist the devil. Be alert. Trusting in God is not an excuse for the Christian to do nothing. Rather, it's motivation for us to go forward in confidence. You know, it strikes me as maybe a little ironic that the first two cliches I picked are almost polar opposites of one another. Right? And together, I think they illustrate a tension that's existed in the Christian world really since Jesus ascended back into heaven. So God helps those who help themselves compared to let go and let God. Right? That's the question Christians have been asking since the church began. Is the Christian life about my effort and my service to God, or is it about trusting in God to take care of me? Is the Christian story one of diligent work, or is it trusting rest in him? In other words, is my salvation earned by works, or does it come as a gift of grace? And so for every generation of the church has to wrestle with this tension. And at different times, the church has landed with different emphases. Sometimes the church wants to emphasize the Christian's responsibility and our need to work hard in our faith. At other times, the church wants to emphasize God's sovereignty and grace. And yet, the Bible is not afraid to take these two ideas and lay them side by side. What we see as contradictory, the Bible actually sees as complementary. Trusting that God is in control of the world is not an excuse for us not to work, but rather it's motivation to work harder. The gift of salvation by grace does not eliminate the need for good works, but it lays the foundation for them. God provides for the birds of the air go out and work. God takes all of our cares and upon himself, and that's motivation for us to stand up against the devil. Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 says this, puts these two ideas in back-to-back verses. Therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You do the work, right? God helps those who help themselves. But then verse 13, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. The key word in these verses, I think, is the little word that starts verse 13, that word for. Because. You can work hard, Christian, because God has already done the work in you. Because God has secured your salvation for you, now you can work hard to work that out in your life and in the world. So to conclude, I'd like to share a quote from J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer was a Christian statesman in the last half of the 20th century, and this is something he tweeted out shortly before he died. He said this. He said, the Christian's motto should not be let go and let God, but instead trust God and get going. Trusting God doesn't mean taking your hands off the steering wheel. Instead, trusting that God has this means you put your hands on the steering wheel and you drive hard after him.